I want to pivot to a topic that you are very much expert in, which is the regulatory component and a large, very, very, very important aspect to our discussion today. So Nina, how is REGENXBIO working with regulatory agencies to streamline the approval process for AAV, gene therapies, especially considering the recently published BGTC regulatory playbook? And of course, the BGTC regulatory playbook is a really comprehensive resource by the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium to, streamline that process of moving AAV-based gene therapies from lab to clinic. So, yeah, just wondering how you're working with those agencies.
Yeah, so we're pleased to be partnering with BGTC to really work collaboratively to bring AAV gene therapies to patients with very high unmet need, while also moving the AAV gene therapy platform forward to more broadly patient populations in hopes of addressing more diseases. The selected programs in BGTC actually use either AAV8 or AAV9 as their capsids for their gene therapies. And one of the programs for MPS IV actually started as a program here at REGENX as a collaboration with Nemours, who is now the sponsor of this program at BGTC. So we are very well aware of that program. We're excited to continue to be a part of that and supporting Nemours. I think, of course, collaboration across stakeholders is an important way to accelerate the development of novel therapeutic approaches. In addition to BGTC, we've looked for other opportunities to really advance the science and discussions around gene therapy. Recently, there was a workshop hosted by the Reagan-Udall Foundation, and it was on qualifying biomarkers to support rare disease regulatory pathways. And that was a really great meeting where all the stakeholders got together and really made efforts to move forward discussions, including patients, industry regulators, academia, payers, and other stakeholders, including FDA, to construct an ideal pathway for some of those genetic conditions.
Good. Okay. Now at the top of our call, we talked a little bit about, moving beyond, common diseases, or rare diseases into more common disorders. And so what would you say are the key regulatory challenges you foresee for AAV gene therapies from a regulatory perspective, though, as we move towards treating more common diseases beyond rare genetic disorders?
And so I think coming back to benefit risk, I think that's key, and having these discussions with the agency and other regulators as early as possible. For example, addressing issues around anti-AAV antibodies and dosing older patients who may have more natural exposure, and then having discussions around potential approaches to alleviate, to allow that dosing. This is a bit different, but one example from our RGX-314 wet AMD program is we recently presented positive data from the first fellow eye study for a gene therapy in wet AMD. And these are patients from our phase 1/2 studies who've opted to have their second eye dose. And this is the newest data showing that not only positive efficacy data was achieved, but also the previous exposure to the drug was not a risk. And so having these discussions with the agency, as they too are also learning from this clinical experience, I think has been really helpful as a regulatory strategy to just continue to build on the evidence.
Okay, good. Talk to us a little bit about so long-term follow-up studies. How does REGENXBIO address the regulatory requirements for long-term follow-up studies and that assess the durability and safety of AAV gene therapies?
Yes, I think this is pretty straightforward, knowing that the requirements for AAV gene therapy and long-term follow-up are 5 years. And so we've incorporated long-term follow-up into all of our programs and really rolled our patients over to allow for evaluation up to that time point. And I think it's important to note that transparency and long-term data is critical for patients. And so we are dedicated to make sure not only do we gather that information, but provide the evidence to the regulators, but also to patients so that they can make better decisions.
Good, gotcha. Now, what regulatory pathways or designations, whether that be, for example, breakthrough therapy, PRIME, have been most beneficial for advancing your AAV therapies? And do you see these evolving? If so, how? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think every designation comes with some benefits, right? Even if it's just increased communication with the agency, which is key. We have found that having those strategic communications is really helpful to accelerating programs and really like asking the right questions at the right time. The FDA has been very open and supportive, and we appreciate their willingness to continue to be collaborative and interactive. For AAV gene therapy, though, I do think RMAT has been helpful. I think not only does RMAT allow one to have more interactions with FDA, but under the provisions of the law, post-approval requirements for RMAT receiving accelerator approval may be satisfied in additional ways that provide more flexibility. And we don't have a lot of examples of approved products in this space yet, but I think lots of people are there and really seeing how these decisions will come in the next year or so will be really helpful to better understand really the benefits of RMAT and this additional post-market flexibility. But I would say from our experience, RMAT has been really helpful.
Good. Okay. Yeah, we also cover RMAT and on Cell and Gene all the time, and your sentiments are echoed there as well. Talk to us a little bit about how you're working with regulators to establish appropriate endpoints, and back to the topic that we were talking about up at the top, the kind of clinical trial designs. So clinical trial design for AAV gene therapies, and especially diseases where the traditional clinical endpoints may not be suitable.
Yeah, so as mentioned earlier, I think there are informal ways to be working with the agency, and this is where we can bring stakeholders together to have a collective discussion with the agency. It's helpful for them and it's helpful for the sponsors, right? And so the Reagan-Udall Foundation workshop is a really good example. So different diseases, but the same approaches, right? And so if there are considerations that are important for the agency to keep in mind and to help us sort of solve through these hurdles, it's really efficient to be able to bring your colleagues together to have those discussions, especially in rare diseases, right? So for example, how do we think about use of natural history when a placebo is not easily sort of included in your clinical study, right? Especially for AAV gene therapy, whether natural history exists, sort of what is the bar for being able to use that? Is a great example. And then around surrogate endpoints, what would be acceptable as a surrogate endpoint, and sort of general requirements around that. I think those are two great areas to get alignment from the agency as a field together.
Yeah, sure. I know I could talk to you about this all day. I just have a few more questions on the regulatory aspect of this before we turn our attention over to our audience questions. And please do continue to submit questions for our panelists. We're excited to answer them. Just a few more really important regulatory topics. Talk to us a little bit, Nina, about how REGENXBIO is addressing regulatory requirements for vector shedding studies and potentially, the potential environmental impacts of AAV gene therapies.
And so non-clinical shedding data in multiple excreta informs that selection, right, of what samples to collect during clinical development. So thinking about this early on is really important, as you have to plan for the time of collection. And the result obtained from measuring vector genomes by sensitive molecular assays that you have in the clinical studies are important so that you can provide that recommendation on duration for preventative measures to minimize any environmental exposure to patients, caregivers, or other household members. And one part that we really had interactions with the FDA that was really helpful is to complete an environmental risk analysis. And this is what you would submit to the FDA for review. And this is something that we've done already for our program. And so far we haven't seen a concern in any of our studies to date, but these are important sort of studies to plan ahead of time.
Sure. Finally, and I think I'll certainly pose this question to David too before we move on. But Nina, first, what regulatory guidance do you anticipate or hope to see in the the near future that could significantly impact the development of AAV gene therapies?
Yeah. So this doesn't directly answer your question, but I just wanted to know, like just last week, there was a draft guidance around expedited programs for serious conditions, specifically focused on accelerated approval. I know we all know the 2014 final guidance very well as we think about expedited programs, right? How to move efficiently in this space. So having sort of accelerated approval carved out in this new draft is helpful, and I think the field is looking at sort of what was in there and how we can better provide comments, and I think that's important for the field to be able to do, given that accelerated approval is such an important tool for AAV gene therapy, especially for rare diseases. And I know that there might be additional guidances coming out around accelerated approval. I think one specifically on human gene therapy products for rare diseases. So looking forward to that to see if there are any differences or additional flexibilities that would be provided by the agency is something that we're really looking forward to if I had to pick one.
Okay, thanks. And David, I want to be able to certainly offer you the opportunity to answer this question. I know, you don't sit in regulatory all the time, but
sure. I think for the the newer guidances, around potency assurance that we've seen, and platform, I think platform processes, I think is obviously very helpful. Back to the BGTC and the sort of the push, through that to make things again more standard, so that if you've developed one strategy that you can apply it to your next product, I think is a very important regulatory piece going forward. And I think Nina touched on it a little bit, but a little bit better guidance of we still see a lot of our clients having to go through and do placebo-controlled trials where I don't know that they're often necessary, and a bit more guidance there on maybe the need to not have those placebo-controlled trials. Be able to leverage the national history. Yeah.